This is a symposium, the keynote address for a symposium we're having today on the Civil War and religion. This symposium is hosted by the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor. If you don't know about the Institute for Studies of Religion, its primary goal is to initiate, support, and conduct research on religion across academic disciplines. And so we don't just do history of religion, but we're engaged in social sciences, sociology, psychology, and so forth, medicine, other subjects, in the way that faith and religion touches on those subjects. And so we seek to foster the highest quality of academic research on religion, and also seek to engage broader public discussions about the role of religion in those areas and in American life. And one of the ways that we seek to fulfill our mission is by hosting conferences and symposia on topics like this. And this is sponsored under the auspices of the Program in Historical Studies of Religion at the Institute, which I co-direct. I'm Thomas Kidd, and I'm the co-director of the Program on Historical Studies of Religion, along with my colleague Philip Jenkins. And we thought it was an obvious topic this year. I think many of you know that this is the year of the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War, 1861 to 2011. And so we wanted to host this symposium on the 150th anniversary to examine the role that faith played in the American Civil War. Obviously, America at that time was a heavily religious society, living in the kind of aftermath of the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century. And it's important to understand what role that faith played in the most traumatic war in all of American history. We had a panel discussion on this this morning that was just excellent. And I know some of you were there for that. And then now we're going to have the keynote address of our symposium, and our speaker is George Rable. George Rable is the Charles D. Summersell Chair in Southern History at the University of Alabama, and is one of the country's leading experts on the era of the Civil War. Most of his work, actually up until this point, has been about the political and military history of the Civil War era, and his books include a number of topics, 1984's But There Was No Peace, The Role of Violence in the Politics of Reconstruction. In 1989, he published Civil Wars, Women in the Crisis of Southern Nationalism. In 1994, The Confederate Republic, A Revolution Against Politics, the University of North Carolina Press. In 2002, he published the simply titled Fredericksburg, also with the University of North Carolina Press. And that book won the Lincoln Prize in Civil War history, among many other prizes. And his most recent book, The Turn to Religion for Professor Rable, is God's Almost Chosen Peoples, a religious history of the American Civil War, University of North Carolina Press, and it came out just last year. And his talk for us today is going to be based on that book, God's Almost Chosen Peoples, on religion and the Civil War. So help me to welcome Professor George Rable.
Well, thank you very much, Tommy, for that gracious introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to see this beautiful campus. First trip to Baylor. Friend Mike Parrish even took us over to see the Bears. So, you know, as an LSU grad, I'll admit I prefer Mike the Tiger, but that's okay. As an LSU grad who teaches at Alabama and has a daughter who graduated from Auburn, I do know civil wars in athletics as well as the American Civil War. And since the subject today is war and religion, I'm not going to be saying anything controversial, so you won't have to worry about that in the least. In some ways, Abraham Lincoln kicks this off when he stated in his second inaugural address on March 4, 1865, that both sides prayed to the same God and read the same Bible. And they did. And he might have added they read it in remarkably similar ways. I think religious language, religious imagery, and ideas were absolutely pervasive during the Civil War era, before, during, and after that great conflict. It was estimated in 1855 that out of a population of about 27 million people, about 4 million were members of some Protestant church. Now, I've asked students about this question over the years, and they say that's surprisingly low. They would think that number would be much higher. And again, these are estimates, but you have to remember that the standards for church membership in the 19th century were somewhat higher than they are today. And the attendance numbers would probably be much higher than that 4 million. For example, when my wife and I joined Forest Lake United Methodist Church in Tuscaloosa, we had to mumble answers to a couple simple questions, and then they handed us the offering envelopes, which is not set, that doesn't set the bar very high. In the 19th century, to be a member of, particularly of the evangelical churches, you might have to be willing to have your behavior scrutinized. You might have to set the bar of membership a little higher. So you would typically have lots of people perhaps attending a particular congregation who weren't necessarily members. And you also have to throw in 1 million or 2 Roman Catholics into the mix as well. Whatever the exact proportions of believers in the late 19th century, I think there is a powerful sense of providence in the way people viewed life. In fact, if there's one word that best summarizes this talk, I think it would be that word, providence. Not only the extraordinary events in a nation's life, but the ordinary events of human life are interpreted in providential terms. There was a strong belief that the story of America was part of an unfolding providential design, part of a larger story of human history, if you will. Now, mere mortals like us could perhaps at times catch a glimpse of the larger meaning of this history, but human history, both in its long sweep and its messy details, remained in God's hands, and people of all kinds of religious traditions fully believed that. This kind of God talk was absolutely commonplace in the 19th century. It was simply part of the language of ordinary life, applied to the vicissitudes of ordinary life. Storms, death, destruction, whatever, if your cow got sick, it was all providential. So it's hardly surprising then that Americans would use their religious beliefs, and especially their beliefs about providence, to interpret the sectional crisis of the 1850s and the Civil War itself. Today, however, much of this experience is forgotten, not only by Civil War historians who have done basically a terrible job with religion because they've been largely AWOL on the subject, but also by the general public. We just had the 9/11 anniversary, right? Well, in the aftermath of 9/11, Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, and Jeremiah Wright, I bet you don't usually hear those three in one sentence, but there they are, all interpreted the events of 9/11 in providential terms as God's judgment for sin. In all the journalistic coverage of those statements, I could not find a single person who actually recognized that Falwell, Robertson, and Wright all spoke out of a particular religious tradition, out of a providential interpretation of history. Now, you don't have to buy their explanations, but I noticed the journalists didn't even understand that that was an important part of the American religious tradition. And certainly over the years, if you read the great narratives of Bruce Catton, Shelby Foote, or James McPherson, they don't pay much attention to religion as well, which would have really struck the people of the 1860s as odd, if not perverse. Because the sectional tensions of the 1850s, the secession crisis in the winter of 1860-61, were clearly seen in religious terms by millions of Americans. All of this was seen as a punishment for individual and collective sins. Virtually all groups embraced a providential interpretation of current events. Less than a month after the firing on Fort Sumter, a leading Quaker weekly observed that national sins, unless repented of, are always punished by national calamities. Even Unitarians talked of the nation approaching Pentecostal days. I don't know about you, but when Unitarians start talking about the Pentecost, my ears perk up. I think something important is going on here. So the war itself, then, was seen simply as an example of divine judgment on the entire nation. But if that was so, what purpose did it serve? What was God's purpose in this great conflict, and how could human beings discern that purpose? Well, one obvious purpose was, of course, that war was a punishment for sin. But, of course, that begs the question, for which sins are we being punished? No problem with that. We can come up with a long list. Was it slavery? Was it political corruption? Was it excessive partisanship? Was it greedy materialism? You know, sort of broad social sins. Or what about individual sins? Sabbath breaking, profanity, gambling, drunkenness. Take your choice. Broad definitions of sin cross theological and sectional lines. There was not necessarily a conservative emphasis on individual sin or a reformist emphasis on collective sin. Those tended to cross lines. Abolitionists, for example, were often big temperance reformers as well. And some people thought slavery and alcohol were equally serious national problems. Many preachers and lay people, north and south, compiled long lists of transgressions. So, of course, there were some distinctive sectional themes, and we'll start off with the Confederates. As far as the Confederates were concerned, God had to be on their side because there was the godless federal Constitution. What do I mean by the godless federal Constitution? There's no reference to the Almighty in the U.S. Constitution, compared to the Confederate Constitution that invokes the favor of Almighty God right off the bat. In fact, there was a wartime movement in the North to add some acknowledgement of God or even of Jesus Christ into the federal Constitution. That move didn't get very far. Lincoln was not excited about it, and it kind of died a-borning. But they were a little bit defensive about that. Some Confederates even argued that the nation was being punished for what they termed political preaching. That is, preachers interfering in politics. What they actually meant was preachers preaching against slavery, which they labeled conveniently political preaching. Virtually all the Southern clergy defended slavery in one way or another, though many acknowledged that slaveholders, being human beings, had fallen short of biblical standards in dealing with their slaves. But whatever these sectional differences, religious voices, whether Union or Confederate, seldom expressed any doubt that God was on their side. There was very little doubt expressed in either section on that point. And although some pious young men and their families might sometimes ask whether a good Christian or a good Jew could be a soldier, most churches and clergy answered with a very simple and very decided and very resounding yes, they could be soldiers. Now, I'm a Methodist, so I'm going to sort of pick on my fellow Methodists in this talk a little bit. I'm not going to pick on the Baptists since I'm on a Baptist campus. I've got a talk I've got to give next week in Louisville where I'm going to pick on some Baptists, but I'm going to pick on my fellow Methodists for the time being here. The opening prayer of a New York Methodist conference came right to the point. If you'll pray with me. We ask thee to bring these men, the rebels, to destruction and wipe them from the face of the country. That's the northern version. Writing to his brother, a Southern Methodist minister, matched that kind of blood-curdling rhetoric. It is a righteous war. I feel a deep Christian and inextinguishable hatred toward the demons of the North, who would desolate my country and destroy its liberties. It is doing God service to kill the diabolical wretches on the battlefield. Clearly, as these examples show, sectional loyalties often predominated in the church's reaction to the war. A Southern Methodist deemed the Confederate States of America the last hope of freedom and the last home of the pure gospel on the face of the earth. Northern civil religion was just as fervent. "We will take our glorious flag," declared Methodist Bishop Matthew Simpson, "and nail that flag just below the cross." And I've sometimes wondered if Bishop Simpson didn't want to maybe nail it a little above the cross. Now, for sure, Quakers and Mennonites and peace churches tried to maintain their witness against war, but they did so with difficulty, and they often had to do so circumspectly. Many Quaker young men were in fact remarkably eager to enlist in the conflict, much to the dismay of the leaders of that church. And even though Quakers sought exemption from conscription and even received a sympathetic hearing from Abraham Lincoln, the Quakers faced some difficulty. But again, the Quakers do not press very hard. They do not advise tax resistance, for example, and they recognize that many of their young people are caught up in the excitement, and to the extent that the Quakers are anti-slavery, the war puts them in something of a pickle. Can you use military means to get rid of slavery? But again, the peace people are very much the exceptions to the rule. Most Americans of a religious bent turn to their faith to explain and justify the course of the war. Notions of providence, the idea of the war as punishment for sin, apocalyptic warnings of divine judgment, all of these become powerful and very flexible ideas with which to interpret wartime events. Now, of course, religion during a time of upheaval and conflict provides comfort for the anxious and the grieving, and it certainly does that for millions of individuals and millions of families. But for our purposes today, I think it's more important to look at religion as offering an explanation for the suffering and anguish of the war, and specifically for victory and defeat. In fact, battles and their results become signs of divine judgment. One could literally write a religious military history of the Civil War. You could do that. You could take a military narrative and put in a religious narrative right alongside. And I only have time today to cite one example, but I think it's a good one. The first major battle of the Civil War, First Bull Run, or as the Confederates called it, First Manassas. Here, a bungled Federal flank attack and fierce Confederate counterattack just north of Manassas Junction, Virginia, drove the Yankees skedaddling back toward Washington. The entire Battle of First Bull Run summarized in one sentence. No small achievement for a Civil War historian, because we usually like to talk about these battles at somewhat greater length. But that's sort of what happened there. But the question is, how do you interpret it? A Virginia woman living in the Shenandoah Valley, on hearing the early reports of the fight, prayed that Providence would guide the Confederates to victory. And for the victorious Confederates, it seems that that's exactly what had happened. Their victory was a sign of divine favor. And of course, this becomes the way you explain victories throughout the war. God is smiling on you when you win. Need we further proof of God's providence that our cause is just and that the South shall triumph? One enthusiastic Confederate Methodist asked. But of course, what about all the brave and pious young men who fell in this first great battle of the war? There was an assumption at the beginning of the war that the Lord would safeguard the righteous in battle. In other words, if you were a righteous soldier and you went into battle, the Lord would protect you from the enemy bullets. But it soon became clear that in every major engagement, many pious young men would fall on the battlefield. There was no guarantee of divine protection in any particular battle. So soon, printed sermons, and a lot of unprinted ones for that matter, eulogized Christian soldiers who had faced death fearlessly and then could look forward to reunion with their loved ones in heaven. Heaven was increasingly interpreted during the American Civil War as a homey place, where when you died, you'd be reunited with your relatives. I guess whether that was a good thing or a bad thing would depend on the nature of your relatives, but anyway, I guess it was more or less seen as a good thing. And certainly letters sent home by chaplains and other officers, along with countless articles in the religious press, reported the last words of soldiers declaring their faith during their final moments on earth. We have to remember that most people at that time died at home with their families, and now they're dying far away from home, and their families have no sense about the state of their soul, and they're very concerned about that. Indeed, the deaths of these fine young men, whether from wounds or more often from disease, none of this seemed to shake people's faith in God's sovereignty. As one South Carolina minister told his congregation shortly after the Confederate victory at Manassas, "Not one of these brave men has fallen or suffered without God's permission." In other words, the divine hand was present throughout the conflict. Now, this was hardly a surprising sentiment in an era in which people believed that every death and every illness and every event, indeed, conformed to God's will. Some folks believed that the Lord had actually chosen the field of combat at Manassas, had supplied courage to the soldiers, and had even controlled the timing of troop maneuvers and tactical movements. By the same token, God had confounded the mighty Yankee army, just as he had scattered the Assyrians and the Midianites and the Philistines in Old Testament times. And one reference that must have surely resonated with virtually everybody, an Alabama minister, and you can fill in the blank on this one for me, I think, explained at some length how the southern David had slain the northern Goliath. Okay, thanks. The first great battle of the war had seemingly vindicated the Confederate cause. It sent people leafing through their Bibles to search for references to the southern nation in prophecy. The smallest incidents became signs of divine favor. We have the first accounts of Bibles stopping bullets, which they do. I mean, that did happen. It always seemed the point of the projectile would stop at a particularly pertinent verse. They often reported the exact verse at where it stopped. Though one young man delighted in telling his mother that it wasn't a Bible that stopped the bullet, but it was a deck of cards in his pocket. In any event, it seemed that all the Southern people had to do was simply give God the glory and keep their trust in Him, and they would win the war. Not surprisingly, Northern believers took a somewhat different tack after the First Battle of Bull Run. "The judgments of God are upon us," declared one Presbyterian editor. I guess not surprising, Presbyterians always emphasize divine judgment, at least they used to. The nation's leading Methodist newspaper, the Christian Advocate and Journal in New York, agreed that the defeat had doubtless been ordered by Providence as part of a severe but wholesome discipline, which in the end will cure some desperate evil that have existed among us. In other words, we are being punished for our own good. God had shaped the nation's history and would continue to do so. And as was typical after every battlefield loss on both sides, the defeated side tried to figure out which sins had stirred up God's wrath. Was it slavery? Was it political corruption? Was it materialism? Favorite candidates? When was Bull Run fought? On a Sunday. But the Confederates had fought on Sunday, right? You know, both sides had to fight on Sunday, so the battle we fought on Sunday. But those dastardly Yankees had attacked on the Sabbath. See, that's why they lost. Very clear, very clear. The failure to observe the Sabbath in camp, swearing, alcohol, all of these helped explain Union defeat at Bull Run. Yet Horace Bushnell, a prominent congregational minister and theologian, in the aftermath of this battle, delivered a remarkable sermon with the provocative title, "Reverses Needed." We would probably title it defeats needed. He's using reverse in the sense of defeats. Reverse is needed. He worried that defeat at Bull Run was a warning to the nation that in his view had created a government without moral or religious ideas. Again, there's no mention of God in the U.S. Constitution. Bushnell termed Jefferson's Declaration of Independence nothing but godless theorizing. He was not a fan of Jefferson. He said, no wonder the American Union must face reverses and losses, such as the Battle of Bull Run, because, as he put it, without shedding of blood, there is no such grace prepared. And it's interesting, after the Civil War, Bushnell would write at some length on the atonement. And of course, there was plenty of blood to be shed during the Civil War and a lot of atonement to be written about. Bushnell, for his part, however, had no doubt that the North was fighting for just principles. He had no doubt that God was on the side of the Union. But he also believed that many more sacrifices would be needed to atone for national transgressions. So you have a Confederate version of Manassas. You have a Northern version of Manassas. African-American clergy in the aftermath of this first battle warned that the nation had not yet faced up to the sins of slavery, and that explains the outcome of the battle. Some African-American clergy debated whether Lincoln's call for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, and we should note that both presidents, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, will regularly call for days of fasting, humiliation, and prayer during the war after defeats, and days of thanksgiving after victories. But these African-American clergy debate whether Lincoln's call should even be observed. Henry McNeill Turner, who would later serve as one of the first African-American chaplains, described the dead at Bull Run as the bloody victims of slavery's hellish caprice. And indeed, many abolitionists of both races now argued that God would allow the bloodshed to continue until African slavery was banished from the nation. In other words, until the nation got rid of the sin of slavery, the war would drag on. Throughout the conflict, denominations, churches, and individuals, North and South, agonized and debated and argued over the role of slavery in the war. Christians of various stripes, of course, had long debated whether God opposed, sustained, or was indifferent to slavery. And there were church leaders and churches that took all of those, each one of those positions at one point or another. But the war reshaped the discussion of slavery in both the North and the South. In the North, by the fall of 1862, even the more conservative denominations were moving to see the death of slavery as a military, if not a moral necessity. And many believed the northern side could not prevail, so long as they clung to what one minister termed the Jonah of slavery. Even pacifist Quakers are arguing that God was using the war to punish the nation for the sin of slavery. And of course, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary one issued in the fall of 1862, the final one on January 1, 1863, led ministers of both races, not surprisingly, to invoke the Exodus story, or even talk of the imminent return of Christ. The biggest exception were the Roman Catholics, who had long been opposed to abolition as a dangerous, radical, and infidel ideology. In fact, the Catholics argued from the beginning that the principles that had kept the Catholic Church together could have prevented the war. Northern Catholic editors in particular during the secession crisis argue that you wouldn't have had a war if the nation had been Catholic. As far as they were concerned, secession was the logical culmination of schismatic Protestant principles. Where you have Protestants, you're going to have division. Hence, you have war. In the Confederacy, Southern churches remained largely united behind the new Southern nation and behind slavery. Loyal Confederates refused to see the war as a punishment for the sin of slavery. That's hardly surprising. But as the war dragged on and the casualties mounted, defending slavery became more complicated even for Confederates. Church associations and ministers readily conceded that even though in their view slavery was sanctioned by the Scriptures, the behavior of many slaveholders had fallen short of biblical standards. Churches decried the neglect of religious instruction. Some even condemned laws that had discouraged teaching slaves to read. Because if you can't read the Bible. So why should there be laws against teaching slaves to read? Reformers called for the legal recognition of slave marriages, or for laws prohibiting the breakup of families through sale. So you have a sort of slavery reform movement in the midst of the war. Now, it's very clear that some churches and ministers merely gave lip service to such ideas, but others pressed for them in the political arena. The implicit promise of slavery reform, of course, is if such reforms were adopted, this would win God's favor on the battlefield and the course of the war might shift. I think it's significant that none of these proposed reforms got anywhere in the political arena. I mean, nowhere. None of them got out of committee, much less onto the floor of the Confederate Congress or a state legislature. There was just no great public support for this. It was a few clergy and churches pushing for it, and nobody paid much attention. So the war continued. And the continuance of this great conflict, and especially the mounting casualties and the suffering on the home front, seemingly challenged a providential view of the war's course. Why such horrendous sacrifices? Why such horrendous losses? Why this continuous suffering? And one of the things we forget about the American Civil War, in 1863 and 1864, there were a fair number of people on both sides who thought that this war seemed to just likely to continue into the indefinite future. They could see no end of this in sight. But they also believed that human beings at best could achieve only an imperfect understanding of God's will. And because biblical history proved that the Lord had often used heathen nations to punish his stiff-necked people, even in 1864, believers north and south had hardly abandoned their civil religion. The Lord was still on our side. Fill in whichever side you want that to be. He will continue to punish us from time to time, but ultimately he will lead us to victory. God's purposes might be inscrutable, but he remained in control of this war. Now, of course, in 1864, horrific bloodletting at places such as Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse and Cold Harbor and Petersburg might readily lead war-weary soldiers and civilians to speak of pointless sacrifices. And many did speak of pointless sacrifices. It seemed logical enough for the clergy to assert that the war had spun out of human control. You know, but human beings are remarkably resilient, so every time you won a victory, this would rekindle hope of divine favor. And of course, defeats could still be explained in terms of divine chastisement, presumably temporary chastisement. The kind of spiritual discipline for those whom God loved. And of course, the preachers regularly trotted out the usual lists of sins, though increasingly they talked, especially in the Confederacy, about greed and extortion, what a later generation would call war profiteering, people taking advantage of suffering to line their own pockets. This explained why the war continued. Confederates in particular talked about their churches languishing, ministers being poorly paid. Aren't ministers always poorly paid? I thought that was kind of a constant. Sunday schools neglected. Many souls being lost. Many church associations, and the Baptist Church Association minutes for the Civil War period are absolutely fascinating because they report on all kinds of things. And a lot of them talk about a spiritual coldness among the churches. maybe too a sign of divine disfavor. Maybe that too accounts for a kind of wartime suffering. In the fall of 1862, the Georgia Methodist Bishop George F. Pierce sounded an almost Lincoln-esque note and could not chase away a deep sense of foreboding. He said, "We are in the Lord's hands. I know not what he means to do with us. In many respects, the prospects before us are dark. We have wrought wonders, but seem to have gained nothing. The war is without parallel in the past as to its origins, its battle, its progress, and its results so far. I hope for the best, but I am looking to God alone. Vain is the help of man." Vain is the help of man. In the North, there was also talk of a kind of spiritual malaise. Northern Methodists supposedly lost 60,000 members during the war in one way or another. And Southern Methodists may have lost a third of their membership. Baptists, Presbyterians reported similar losses. Beginning in 1862, however, both Federals and Confederates began to experience periods of religious revival, though mainly in the armies. Not so much at home, but mainly in the armies. Suddenly, it seemed, denominational differences that had seemed very important back home. You know, you knew whether you were a Baptist or a Methodist or a Presbyterian or Episcopalian. You knew why, you knew that mattered. In the Army, they didn't seem to matter so much. These sectarian prejudices, if you will, however, did not entirely disappear. There's a great diary by a Lutheran chaplain named John H. Stuckenberg, who wrote at one point, "I am surrounded by Methodists who are very clever but lack cultivation." What an insulting thing to say. There were occasional disputes in camp between Methodists and Baptists over the proper method of baptism. Should a newly converted soldier be sprinkled? Heaven forbid, right on this campus, or immersed. In fact, one Confederate Baptist editor accused the Presbyterians, likely opponents, of sneaking in material on infant baptism into some of the tracts that were distributed to soldiers. You never know when the insidious ideas of infant baptism, where they might be lurking. It might be reasonable for you to ask at this point, and I'll save you the trouble because I'll try to answer this question, to what extent do the soldiers interpret the war's course in providential terms? In fact, if people back home are calling them Christian soldiers, are they in fact Christian soldiers? Well, it's probably no news to anybody that, you know, young men from their late teens into their early 30s are not the best material in terms of religious appeals. They can be rather resistant at times, and Civil War soldiers were no exception. A number of years ago, my friend Joe Gladauer, who wrote this wonderful book, General Lee's Army, came up to me at a conference and pulled me aside. And Joe looked sort of worried, and he had a serious, he had actually, we were at a kind of a party, but he had a serious question he asked. He said, "Do you think most of these soldiers were religious?" And I said, "I don't really think so." He says, "Good, I don't think so either." And that's about the best we'll come up with, but I think it's important to recognize that a very, very sizable minority, and I mean sizable minority, I can't give you any numbers, but at least a sizable minority, were very religious, and they also tended to be the soldiers that probably stuck to it the best. They were more the long-term service sort of people, but I don't think we'll ever really know the proportions, but I thought I'll throw that out. And in fact, there had been widespread reports early in the war about indifference to religion in the armies. No Sabbath. There's no Sabbath in the Army. I'd like to have $10 for every time I read that in a diary or a letter. A lot of drinking and gambling and swearing and all sorts of things going on in the Army. A lot of criticism of chaplains. The chaplains were kind of a mixed lot. If you have questions about chaplains, I can answer those later on. Both sides reduced the pay of chaplains during the war, which suggests that Political leaders didn't think much of the chaplains either. But by 1862, we read the first reports of religious revivals, especially among the Confederates. And the hope is not only will the revivals convert individual souls, but maybe if the revivals extend far enough, maybe this will be a way of restoring divine favor. Converted soldiers were supposedly more effective soldiers. Though ministers and many men themselves readily avowed that individual salvation was their first priority. And if you read the tracts distributed during the war, most of them have nothing to say about the war itself. They're simply standard religious tracts. If you read the sermons preached to soldiers in camp, they usually were not war-related. They dealt with the traditional themes of salvation. So the emphasis was on conversion. And if that helped the nation, so much to the good. It's also fair to say that many of the soldiers themselves could sound like ministers in discussing the hand of God in battle and emphasizing the importance of religion as a source of comfort. And it's not only the civilians that talk about heavenly reunion, it's also the soldiers as well. And of course, this is a heavenly reunion that takes place, and this is especially important for Confederates late in the war, regardless of which side wins. For Confederates from 1864 on, it seems to me, prayers increasingly focused on spiritual rather than national deliverance, because the prospects of national deliverance were growing dimmer. Both soldiers and civilians could readily believe that peace would only come in the Lord's good time. You could always say that we had not been punished enough. Neither Northerners nor Southerners had yet been punished enough. Ministers on both sides warned against the sin of murmuring against civil authorities, against military commanders, and against God. And in the end, for many Confederates, perhaps defeat with God was not so bad after all. Or at least that was the rationalization that was offered. For the Federals, as the war neared its end, it seemed that the Lord had finally smiled on their cause. The day after the fall of Richmond, the collapse of the Petersburg lines, April 2nd, 1865, in Washington, the U.S. Capitol was brightly illuminated. There was a gaslighted transparency emblazoned with this message: "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." And that is indeed the way they interpreted victory. Though in 1865, you also have something else going on. Already you see the forces of the modern world. You see relentlessly secular tendencies already at play, putting great strains on this providential worldview. But that brings us to the war's ultimate meditation on divine purpose, Lincoln's second inaugural address, which I think is his true masterpiece. I don't think the Gettysburg Address, I'm sorry, can hold a candle to the second inaugural, in my opinion. If you disagree, just don't tell me about it, because you're wrong. Probably the most masterful speech ever delivered by an American president, and certainly the closest thing to a sermon delivered by an American president. Which is ironic for a man who never joined a church, who is accused of being a religious skeptic as a young politician, whose religious views are still being debated by historians, and who had refused to render harsh verdicts about Southerners before or during the war. In fact, throughout the war, Lincoln had refused to do something that had been nearly automatic on both sides. He had refused to equate his cause with God's larger purpose. And even as the Confederates appeared to be collapsing in the spring of 1865, you got to remember on March 4, 1865, Lincoln could see what was going to happen. Victory was at hand. It didn't take a crystal ball to figure that out. He knew what was going on. Yet he refused to yield to the temptation of triumphalism. And his second inaugural address is a very curious thing in many ways, because Lincoln somehow was able to rise above most of the pious cliches that were so popular in the North and South. He noted how both sides had not expected the war to last so long or be so bloody. No kidding. You'd think they would have avoided it had they known that. He said each looked for an easier triumph. Boy, that's true. That's always true in war, isn't it? He said the prayers of both sides could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. That's a tough thought, isn't it? And then he made his key point. The Almighty has his own purposes. That's really not what we want to hear. I want the Almighty's purposes squared with my purposes. Federals and Confederates throughout the war wanted the Almighty's purposes squared with their purposes. And here's the president saying, the Almighty has his own purposes. What is he, some professor talking out of both sides of his mouth? This is an odd, very odd thing to say in a public address. He went on to say if slavery was such an offense to God that the war had to continue, and that both the North and the South had to endure such a terrible war, Lincoln could only conclude, in the words of Psalm 19, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. That was, of course, a very hard affirmation to make in the spring of 1865, because by that time, over 600,000 Americans had lost their lives. Could their friends and family simply say, "Thy will be done," at this point? The Union victory and the Confederate defeat left many hard questions about providence and about the role of God in human history. Left many of those unanswered, as Lincoln himself readily acknowledged. And unlike most politicians, Lincoln recognized that there were questions that cannot be easily answered. But of course, this whole idea of unanswered questions would deal a body blow in many ways to providential interpretations of history. And never again would an American war be interpreted in such openly religious terms as the American Civil War. I was recently asked to give a talk at Birmingham Southern College, and the person planning the talk wanted a provocative title, and so he chose, "Was the American Civil War a holy war?" And I said, well, yes, it was. In fact, probably the holiest war in American history if you define that as a war in which more people interpreted in religious terms. Now, of course, less than 2 months after offering his meditation on the war's meaning, Lincoln himself would fall victim to an assassin's bullet. Was Lincoln's assassination a providential event? Many people at the time thought so, but that's a subject for another occasion. Thank you very much. Questions?
I think we'll have time for some questions. I know some of you may have appointments you need to get to, and now would be a good time to go ahead and take off if you need to, as opposed to dribbling out over the next few minutes. So go ahead and do that in about 30 seconds. We'll start, okay?
Give him a graceful exit.
Yeah, from experience.
Yes.
I did that.
Always a good idea.
And I had students tell me they were going to help.
Yeah, that's fine. Good turnout. Attentive group.
Yeah, yeah.
I always try to find sleeping people to try to wake them up, but I didn't see too many people dozing off, so that's good. Late afternoon is tough.
The bread pudding is setting in.
Yeah. Well, Mike bought us omelets for breakfast, so he contributed.
Do you want to handle it?
Sure.
All right. Who has questions? And Dr. Rable will handle them for you.
Was there something that had happened in Lincoln's life that had precipitated suddenly a kind of a spiritual awareness before the second inaugural address?
Oh, the question was, did something happen in Lincoln's? Yeah, this is a subject of great controversy. I was interviewed, I guess a year or two ago, by Moody Radio for a program they were doing on Memorial Day. And that question was asked me, and then they didn't include my answer. But there was a report that Lincoln underwent this miraculous conversion after the death of his son Willie and after his trip to Gettysburg, that he declared himself a Christian. There's no contemporary evidence for that story. There's no question that the death of Lincoln's first son, Edward, had a deep effect on him. He did not join the Presbyterian Church in Springfield, but he attended. He talked to the minister there, who was an old-school Presbyterian theologian and apparently was influenced by him. Lincoln attended New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington from time to time. And as the war goes on, Lincoln does meditate on the divine will. I think the other great document besides the second inaugural is this document that his secretaries, Nicolay and Hay, labeled Meditation on the Divine Will. And historians have debated on the dating of that. The conventional one was fall of 1862, but now people think it's probably early in 64. But even privately, he's weighing, okay, what can be the divine purpose here? And he tells his cabinet openly, that he had promised God to do something about slavery and was, waiting for the victory at Antietam to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's amazing that a president would say that in a cabinet meeting, not in some public statement where he claimed that. So there is a spiritual growth in Lincoln, but its exact direction, I don't know. Mary Lincoln, interviewed after the war, said that Abe was not a technical Christian. She didn't explain what she meant by that. But Mary was considerably more pious in a conventional sense than he was. But there is this, there were still these stories, and many of the sermons preached after the assassination included the stories of this supposed conversion after Willie's death, or the conversion at Gettysburg. And I think Lincoln's religion is always going to remain, very much a mystery. You have some scholars that say basically Lincoln was an agnostic, and you have people on the other end say, well, he was a quite Orthodox Christian. I would say Lincoln definitely believed in divine providence. Beyond that, I'd be reluctant to go.
How do you think leaders like Jefferson Davis, who was in church when he got the message that Petersburg was falling, how did he react to it? Because he always assumed they were going to win almost all. Yeah,
the question is, how does Jefferson Davis do all of this? I wish we knew more about Davis's religion. Davis had shown no great signs of any religious interest or activity before the war. He's converted to Episcopalianism during the war, attends St. Paul's Church regularly. As you point out, when he received the news of the collapse of the Petersburg line, he was in church. And certainly Davis issues these calls for fasting, humiliation, and prayer during the war. His wartime speeches, suggest more than Lincoln's do, divine favor. But of course, if you're Orthodox, you can always say, wait a minute, who am I, a human being, to interpret God's will? God's will is ultimately inscrutable. This defeat must serve some kind of divine purpose. And certainly, Confederates, defeated Confederates, struggle with this question after the war. You can read the sermons, you can read the letters, you can read the diaries. After Stonewall Jackson dies, after he's killed at Chancellorsville, why did Jackson die? Why did God let Jackson die? I mean, Robert E. Lee clearly asked that question. And there was an Orthodox response. We have put too much faith in an arm of flesh, and God has taken him from us. And there are some Confederates in the aftermath of defeat, I don't think Davis ever said this, but others did, that they had put too much faith in Lee and Jackson, and not enough faith in the Lord, and that's why they lost. So, the theology can explain victory and defeat very readily. It was not that big a problem to them. It's more of a problem to historians who don't understand that sort of framework of. But there's plenty of biblical precedent for everything they're saying. Yes, sir.
One comment. We talked about Lee and Jackson. If they were the entire, if Lee ran the Confederate Army, which he didn't, and Jackson was a major player, but only in the Army of Northern Virginia, and you've got this entire vast western area campaign that we totally ignore, even in our talking about the religious fervor.
Well, I'll be happy to talk about religious fervor in the Western theater. I suspect that question was planted by my friend Mike Parrish down here. He's a big Western theater guy. The revivals in the Western theater tend to come a bit later. But there's a great baptism of Hood and Bragg, and so you have religion on both sides. Jackson and Lee certainly get the most press. You would think from reading most Civil War histories there was not a single pious Yankee general, but there were a number of them. They just weren't very successful. O. Howard. William S. Rosecrans was a devout Catholic. Used to stay up arguing theology with James Garfield late into the night. Probably should have perhaps spent his time, doing some other things. But I mean, you're right. There is a tendency to, the Eastern-centric study of the Civil War, and I was certainly guilty of that in my talk. So I will plead guilty. I will confess to that sin. I'll be happy to. If that's the worst I have to confess to, I'm in good shape. Yes, sir.
Yeah, regarding how meaningful this providential language was for the soldiers themselves, in your book you talk about conviction versus convention, because the language was so right, and it was kind of part of the civil spirituality. One, and as you approach their language, how do you make that distinction? How can you read whether it's conventional or based on conviction? And then two, what's the significance? How does that change you reading, whether it's conventional or conviction, you reading and understanding the kind of providence of the Civil War?
Okay, I think I can repeat the question. The question is, how do you interpret the religious language of the soldier? Is it simply conventional, or does it somehow bespeak deep conviction? Obviously, that's something I think all of us have to approach with a good deal of humility. I think we just have to do it. To me, repetition and volume matter. Volume in terms of how much they say. If somebody simply says after a battle, God's will, and not elaborate, that's one thing. But if they elaborate and go into a little more detail and do it on a consistent basis, and seems to frame their view of the world and what's happening not only in the war but in their own lives, to me that seems to be more conviction. Which is why this whole case of sort of trying to quantify, what portion is a sort of fool's errand. And as a professor of mine said many years ago when I was a very hesitant graduate student, he said, George, if you've done the research, just boldly draw a conclusion. You've got a right to draw a conclusion, You may not be absolutely right, you may not be certain, but if you've done the work, draw the conclusion. And the question of the soldier's conviction versus convention is probably one of the most difficult things to do. And I guess my solution was to simply read as much as I can get a hold of, but I am still amazed at the stuff I continue to find that I wish I'd been able to put in the book, because the volume of this material is just absolutely endless. We're blessed with a lot of material, but that is that's a difficult question to deal with, and that's why historians of the Confederates and Union soldiers have differed on this question. I think my friend Steve Woodworth would probably find a few more pious soldiers than I did, and which of us is right Who knows? Yes, sir.
What is the role of sources in that question? Personal resources, i.e. diaries and letters, versus public resources, i.e. Sermons and newspapers?
The question is sources, public versus private. Let's start with the private first, diaries and letters. First of all, the diaries and letters are not a representative sample. They probably overstate the pious, I suspect. If your ancestor was a real rascal, you might not be as inclined to save the things. The family might be embarrassed, you know, that sort of thing. One of the things I found very interesting in the research was, and there's not as much of this as I wish I'd have found, but statements from religious skeptics. You know, the great Confederate artillerist Porter Alexander wrote after the war, he said Providence didn't care a row of pins about this. And the fact that Jackson and Lee believed that God would suddenly, you know, deliver the Confederacy probably hurt our cause more than helped it. You know, and Alexander was a very good soldier and a very loyal Confederate. He was skeptical about that. On the northern side, there are a number of German immigrants who are 48ers. You know, they've escaped from the revolutions of 1848, and they're very much free thinkers. And they don't even want chaplains in their regiment. Or if they do have chaplains in the regiment, they want a chaplain who doesn't really preach very religious sermons. You know, they could preach once in a while, but, you know, don't say anything about Jesus or anything like that. You know, just sort of, you know, advice for living or something vague and amorphous, you know, like that. Now, public sources, sermons. One of my good and skeptical friends said as I was working on this, how are you going to read all those sermons? Isn't that going to kill you? They're more interesting than you might believe, but you take them in small doses. But the sermons, unfortunately, are not representative either. The published and manuscript sermons overwhelmingly overrepresent the Presbyterians. They badly underrepresent the Methodists. There aren't many published Methodist sermons from the period. The Baptists are pretty well represented. The Unitarians are probably overrepresented too, because you have small numbers, but a fair number of Unitarian sermons have survived. So that's a problem. There are lots of sermons preached on special occasions, Thanksgiving sermons. Every year you would have a raft of Thanksgiving sermons. And often very conventional, hardly connected to the war at all, or sometimes very connected to the war. What I found most interesting, and I sort of stumbled across these, were sermons, funeral sermons for individual soldiers, what they had to say. You know, Johnny had been pious from his youth, that had never sworn and always obeyed his mother, da-da-da. Or you take somebody like Maxie Gregg, who's killed at the Battle of Fredericksburg and had never shown any religious inclinations at all, and the sermon delivered by an ardent Presbyterian, all the virtues listed are Stoic virtues rather than Christian virtues, but he finally says, well, I think Gregg must have surely made peace with his maker at some point, and, you know, sort of sanctifies old Maxie Gregg in the end. So that's a long answer to a deep question, and I probably just scratched the surface, so I apologize for that. Other inquiries? Well, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed it.